Late at night, two sisters in distress knocked. What the old woman saw left her in tears. In this emotional story, we witness the true power of courage and compassion. Two sisters, lost and desperate, find hope when they knock on the door of an elderly woman who shows them kindness beyond measure. As they face the harshness of the world, this act of compassion changes their lives forever. Watch how this story unfolds and see how courage and compassion can create miracles. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Stories TH, for more inspiring content that touches your heart. Late at night, two sisters knocked on an old woman's door, and she looked at their stomachs and cried. It was a cold, bitter night when the tranquility of Mrs. Josephine's home was shattered by an urgent knock on her door. Mrs. Josephine, a seasoned woman in her late 70s, was sitting in her favorite old wooden chair near the fireplace. She was reading a book, her aging hands trembling slightly as she turned each page. But tonight, the sound of knocking sharp and insistent interrupted her peaceful evening. Grasping an oil lamp, Mrs. Josephine made her way to the door. The flickering light illuminated her eyes, clouded by years of experience, yet still sharp and perceptive. With each knock, her heart began to pound with worry. Who could be knocking at this hour, in the freezing cold of winter? As she opened the door, a scene unfolded before her that would change the course of her life. Two young girls, no older than 16, stood shivering on her doorstep. Their faces were pale, their clothing thin and inadequate for such harsh weather. What struck her the most, however, were their swollen bellies. Both of them were heavily pregnant, and it was clear that their due dates were fast approaching. One of the girls, her long brown hair matted with snow, spoke with a voice hoarse from exhaustion and hunger. "Please help us," she whispered, her words barely audible. Without hesitation, Mrs. Josephine stepped forward and ushered the girls into her warm home. "Come inside. Don't stay out here," she urged, shutting the door firmly behind them to keep the cold at bay. Inside, the warmth from the fireplace enveloped them as they sank into the chairs, shivering uncontrollably. Mrs. Josephine quickly moved to her kitchen, preparing cups of hot tea and blankets. She placed them before the girls, her heart heavy with concern. She could see the desperation in their eyes. Who were they? What brought them here, on such a frigid night, to this remote village? As the girls slowly began to calm down, Mrs. Josephine asked in a gentle tone, "Who are you, and why are you out in this weather?" The girl with brown hair, who appeared to be the older of the two, took a deep breath and began her story. Her voice trembled as she spoke, not only from the cold, but also from the fear that had been etched into her heart for weeks. "My name is Mary, and this is my sister Anna. We have nowhere else to go," Mary explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Anna, the younger sister, remained silent. She was exhausted and seemed to be barely holding herself together. Her lips were chapped, and her hands were frostbitten, bearing faint bruises on her wrists. Mrs. Josephine's heart ached as she listened. She had seen the signs of abuse before, though she didn't press them for details. Instead, she stood up quickly and went to the cupboard. She retrieved a loaf of bread, some cheese, and a bowl of warm soup. She placed the food before the girls, her eyes brimming with compassion. "Eat, both of you," she urged. "Don't say anything. You need your strength first." Mary and Anna devoured the food as if they hadn't eaten in days. Mrs. Josephine watched them, wondering what had driven these young girls to such desperate circumstances. She could see the fear in their eyes, but there was something else, something deeply troubling in their story that she had yet to fully understand. When they had finished eating, Mary hesitantly began to speak again. "We used to live in the city," she started, her voice wavering. "I worked at a shop, and Anna was a student. But then a man destroyed our lives." She paused, as if the words were too painful to continue. "His name is Frederick Lawson. He's powerful and wealthy. He took advantage of us, and when the truth came out, he threatened to get rid of us forever if we dared speak out." The anger that surged within Mrs. Josephine was palpable, but she didn't interrupt. She allowed Mary to continue, knowing that this was their story to tell. "He forced us to leave the city, Mary's voice broke as she spoke, her trembling hands clutching the teacup. He said that if we didn't disappear, he would make our lives a living hell. We had no other choice. We've been wandering for weeks, too scared to trust anyone. But when we saw your house, we thought maybe you'd help. As Mary's words sank in, Mrs. Josephine's heart tightened. She could feel the weight of the fear and pain that had brought these girls to her doorstep. It reminded her of her own youth, a time when she, too, had been oppressed by an unjust society and powerful men. She understood all too well the despair that these girls were feeling, and she vowed that she would protect them, no matter what. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," Mrs. Josephine said firmly, her voice filled with a strength that belied her age. "You've come to the right place. No matter what happens, I won't let anyone hurt you." Mary looked at her, eyes filled with gratitude but laced with doubt. "Aren't you afraid?" she asked softly. "Frederick is dangerous. If he finds out you're helping us, he might—" "I'm not afraid," Mrs. Josephine interrupted, her gaze steady. "You don't need to worry about me. Get some rest. We'll figure things out tomorrow." Under Mrs. Josephine's watchful eyes, Mary and Anna laid down on a small bed in the guest room. The firelight flickered against the wooden walls, creating an atmosphere of safety that the girls hadn't felt in a long time. Mrs. Josephine stayed by the fire, her eyes gazing out the window at the falling snow. She knew that by opening her door to these girls, she had placed herself in great danger. But she could not turn them away. In her mind, the images of Mary and Anna, two fragile lives caught in the cruelty of the world, compelled her to promise that she would protect them at all costs. The darkness outside seemed to mirror the fear that gripped her heart, but inside her small house, a light of compassion burned bright and warm, defying the bitter cold of the world outside. This was just the beginning of an incredible journey, one that would test the limits of courage, resilience, and the power of compassion. The struggle against Frederick Lawson, a fight for justice. Frederick Lawson was a man of immense power and influence. At 45 years old, he had carefully crafted an empire that extended far beyond his business ventures. Known throughout the region for his wealth, Frederick was a master of manipulation, using his resources to bend people to his will and silence those who dared to stand in his way. However, his empire was built on a foundation of lies, exploitation, and abuse, with young women as his primary victims. Among his most recent targets were two sisters, Mary and Anna, who had been lured into Frederick's trap under the guise of a promising future. Mary, who had once believed that Frederick was a sophisticated gentleman who would give her a bright future, soon realized the horrifying truth. After he assaulted her, she found herself trapped in a web of fear and manipulation. He used threats, promises of protection, and his considerable power to keep her silent. Mary couldn't tell anyone, not even her sister, Anna, for fear that Frederick would hurt her family. The nightmare didn't stop there. Not long after Mary, Anna also became one of Frederick's victims. The same cruel tactics were used on her, and the sisters found themselves at the mercy of a man whose wealth and influence made him untouchable. Frederick had ties with local law enforcement, bribing officials to cover up his crimes. The police chief, Michael, was among his most trusted allies, turning a blind eye to the evidence and protecting Frederick from any attempts at investigation. Every time the sisters tried to file a complaint or seek help, they were met with rejection and cold dismissals. No one would listen, and it seemed like there was no way out. It wasn't just Mary and Anna who suffered under Frederick's reign of terror. Many other young women had fallen victim to his charms and promises, only to be discarded once they no longer served his purposes. Some had been forced to have abortions, while others were driven out of the village to escape his wrath. There were even whispers of women who had mysteriously disappeared, their families left to mourn without knowing the truth. But the fear that Frederick instilled in the community kept everyone silent. No one dared to speak out, not without facing the consequences. When Frederick discovered that Mary and Anna were pregnant, he became furious. His control over the sisters was slipping, and he couldn't afford to have them bear his children. He was determined to silence them, to erase all evidence of their existence. He made it clear to them that if they didn't comply, their lives would be even more miserable. But despite the threats, Mary and Anna stood firm. They refused to give up their children, vowing that they would protect their unborn babies at all costs. The sisters' refusal to comply marked a turning point. They knew that if they didn't escape Frederick's clutches, their lives would be forfeit. With nowhere else to turn, they sought refuge with Mrs. Josephine, a kind-hearted elderly woman who had lived in the village for many years. Mrs. Josephine, though old and fragile, had lived through her own share of hardship and knew exactly what it meant to fight against an unjust world. She couldn't turn the girls away, even though she knew that by helping them, she was putting herself at great risk. Frederick, realizing that the sisters had found shelter in Mrs. Josephine's home, made his next move. He couldn't allow them to live, not if they were going to testify against him. He knew that with the support of the community and the legal expertise of his son Diego, Mrs. Josephine might have a chance of standing against him. So, he devised a plan to force Mrs. Josephine to surrender the girls. Frederick, with his cold demeanor and ruthless tactics, wasn't one to back down easily. He used his wealth and power to manipulate everyone around him, including local officials, to ensure that he stayed above the law. His reach extended to judges, law enforcement officers, and even politicians. His network was vast and impenetrable, making him seem untouchable. But what Frederick didn't count on was the determination and courage of a few individuals who had had enough of his reign. Diego, Mrs. Josephine's son, had built a reputation as a brilliant lawyer, and when he learned of his mother's plight, he wasted no time in coming to her defense. He knew that taking down someone like Frederick would be no easy task, but Diego was determined. He gathered a group of skilled lawyers who had worked with him for years, and together they began to gather evidence that would expose Frederick's crimes for good. Diego's plan wasn't just about helping his mother and the two sisters. It was about dismantling the corrupt power structure that Frederick had built. The first step in their strategy was to collect testimonies from other victims who had been silenced by fear. Though many were hesitant to speak out, Diego's unwavering determination and the promise of legal protection slowly convinced them to come forward. With each new testimony, the case against Frederick grew stronger. Diego also worked with media outlets and non-governmental organizations to bring the story to the public's attention, shining a light on the atrocities Frederick had committed. As the days passed, the village began to buzz with activity. People who had once been silent now found their voices. The villagers, inspired by the courage of Mary, Anna, and Mrs. Josephine, began to rise up against the powerful man who had held them in fear for so long. A wave of resistance swept through the community, and it became clear that Frederick's reign was coming to an end. In the face of mounting pressure, Frederick attempted to use his usual tactics, bribery, and threats to silence those who opposed him. But Diego was prepared. He and his legal team had already gathered enough evidence to force the authorities to act. As the police finally closed in on Frederick, he was arrested and taken away, his face filled with rage and disbelief. The villagers watched as the man who had terrorized them for so long was escorted away in handcuffs, and a sense of justice finally prevailed. For Mary and Anna, the road to justice had been long and painful, but with the support of Diego, Mrs. Josephine, and the entire village, they finally found the courage to stand up against their abuser. As the trial began and more victims testified, Frederick's power began to crumble. The courtroom was packed with people eager to see the man who had destroyed so many lives finally face the consequences of his actions. In the end, Frederick was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The courtroom erupted in applause as the victims who had suffered in silence for so long finally saw their tormentor brought to justice. The villagers, who had lived in fear for years, could now breathe freely. The small village was forever changed, no longer under the shadow of Frederick's influence. Mary and Anna, their spirits finally free, decided to stay in the village and start new. They opened a small shop and began to rebuild their lives, no longer haunted by the man who had once controlled them. Mrs. Josephine, her heart swelling with pride, watched as the girls recovered from the scars of their past. She knew that despite the darkness that had threatened them, they had emerged stronger, and the village was a better place for it. Diego, though weary from the battle, left the village knowing that he had not only saved his family, but also helped bring about a lasting change in the community. The story of Frederick's downfall became a symbol of hope, proving that no matter how powerful or ruthless someone may be, justice can prevail when people unite in the face of injustice. The village, once stifled by fear, was now a place of renewal, strength, and courage, a place where compassion had triumphed over cruelty. The journey of justice, standing up against injustice in a small, quiet village. A powerful and corrupt man named Frederick Lawson ruled with fear and manipulation. He had built his empire on exploiting vulnerable women, using his wealth, charm, and connections to manipulate people into silence. Frederick's influence stretched far and wide, and those who dared to speak out against him were either silenced or disappeared. His most recent victims were two young sisters, Mary and Anna, who found themselves trapped in a web of lies and abuse. Mary, a young woman with dreams of a better life, was initially taken in by Frederick's charm. He appeared to be a kind and prosperous man, offering her promises of a bright future. But once he had gained her trust, his true nature emerged. After an assault, Mary found herself cornered, with no one to turn to and nowhere to go. Frederick threatened to destroy her life if she ever spoke out, and his manipulation only tightened its grip on her. Anna, Mary's younger sister, soon became another target. Using the same cruel tactics, Frederick took advantage of her as well, and the sisters were left with no option but to run. Frederick's wrath was unyielding. When he discovered that both girls were pregnant, he became furious. His power was slipping, and he needed to eliminate any trace of them to protect his reputation and his empire. The sisters, desperate and scared, fled from the city, wandering for weeks in search of safety. They finally found a place to hide in the remote village where Mrs. Josephine, an elderly woman, lived alone. Mrs. Josephine, despite her frail age, had lived through hardship and injustice in her own youth. She knew the suffering these girls had endured, and her heart ached for them. But she also knew that by offering them refuge, she was putting herself at great risk. Still, her compassion for the sisters prevailed, and she welcomed them into her home, vowing to protect them no matter the cost. Frederick, however, was not one to let his targets escape so easily. As soon as he learned that Mary and Anna had found refuge with Mrs. Josephine, he began to plot their capture. Frederick had a vast network of corrupt officials, including the village's police chief, Michael, who was under his control. Michael had once been an honest man, but years of bribery and threats from Frederick had turned him into a pawn in his game of power. With Frederick's orders, Michael began to pressure Mrs. Josephine to hand over the sisters. But Mrs. Josephine, despite the danger, refused. She knew that if she gave in, not only would Mary and Anna be at the mercy of a monster, but she would be forced to live with the guilt of betraying them. She stood firm, determined to protect the girls at all costs. However, as the situation grew more dire, Mrs. Josephine knew that her resolve would soon be tested. One night, the danger grew even closer. The shadows around her house grew longer as Frederick's men closed in. Mary, who had been trying to stay strong for her sister, could feel the terror mounting. Anna, weak and feverish, needed medical attention, but stepping outside would be impossible without risking their lives. As Mrs. Josephine prepared to defend them, she realized that the battle for their survival had only just begun. Outside, Frederick's men gathered, their presence looming like a dark cloud. The sound of their footsteps in the snow grew louder, signaling that their time was running out. Mrs. Josephine knew that her only option was to protect the girls at all costs. She grabbed a gun for self-defense, aware that her age and frailty meant she had little chance against the men who were coming for her and the sisters. Despite the overwhelming fear, Mrs. Josephine refused to back down. As the men began to break into her home, she stood her ground. With a steady hand, she aimed her gun at the door, ready to fight if necessary. The tension in the room was palpable, but Mrs. Josephine's determination was stronger than ever. The girls, who had never felt so helpless, could only watch in horror as the men approached. When the door finally burst open, Mrs. Josephine's courage was put to the ultimate test. The police chief, Michael, entered with two of Frederick's henchmen. His cold eyes scanned the room, and a sinister smile crept onto his face as he spotted Mary and Anna. But Mrs. Josephine, her resolve unwavering, stepped forward, demanding that they leave. She refused to let Frederick's men take the girls. The confrontation escalated quickly. Michael, angered by her defiance, threatened her with violence, but Mrs. Josephine was ready. She pulled the trigger, sending a bullet into the wall near Michael. The tension reached its peak as the men recoiled in shock. But despite her brave stand, Mrs. Josephine knew this was just the beginning. Frederick would not give up easily, and the battle for the girls' safety was far from over. Meanwhile, Diego, Mrs. Josephine's son, had received word of his mother's predicament. A skilled lawyer, Diego was determined to help. He knew that taking down Frederick was no small task, but he also knew it was a fight that needed to be fought. Diego arrived in the village with his legal team, ready to gather evidence and take on Frederick's powerful network. Diego's arrival sparked a renewed sense of hope in the village. He worked tirelessly to collect testimonies from other victims of Frederick's abuse, including Mary and Anna. With the support of other survivors, they began to build a case against Frederick, one that would expose the full extent of his crimes. Through his perseverance and skill, Diego was able to unravel Frederick's criminal empire and expose his connections to corrupt officials, including the police chief. The fight for justice was far from easy. Frederick used every tactic at his disposal to silence his victims, but the determination of Mary, Anna, and Diego, along with the support of the village, proved to be stronger. With the help of media outlets and human rights organizations, the truth began to emerge. The walls of Frederick's power started to crumble, and eventually, the authorities had no choice but to act. Frederick was arrested and taken away, his face filled with rage and disbelief. The community, once silenced by fear, erupted in celebration as they watched the man who had terrorized them for so long be escorted to jail. For Mary and Anna, it was the beginning of a new chapter. They were free from the man who had destroyed their lives. The trial that followed was a turning point for the community. With the help of Diego and his legal team, Frederick was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. For the first time in years, the villagers could breathe freely, knowing that justice had been served. This story serves as a powerful reminder that no matter how powerful someone may seem, justice can prevail. When individuals stand together with courage and resolve, they can break the chains of fear and bring about real change. It is a call to never stay silent in the face of injustice, to always fight for what is right, and to protect those who are vulnerable. A story of courage, justice, and standing up against injustice in a quiet, remote village. An elderly woman named Mrs. Josephine found herself at the center of an unexpected and dangerous situation. One cold winter night, two young sisters, Mary and Anna, knocked desperately on her door. They were pregnant, exhausted, and fleeing from a man whose name struck fear into the hearts of those who knew him, Frederick Lawson. Frederick, a wealthy and influential man, had built his power on a network of corruption, manipulation, and cruelty. He used his wealth and connections to control people, especially vulnerable women, like Mary and Anna. Mary, once a hopeful young woman, had been taken in by Frederick's charm and promises. She believed that he would give her a future, but instead, she found herself trapped in a nightmare. After an assault, Frederick used threats to ensure her silence, making it clear that anyone who opposed him would face dire consequences. When Anna, Mary's younger sister, also became one of Frederick's victims, the two girls decided to escape with nowhere else to turn. They fled to Mrs. Josephine's house, hoping to find safety. Mrs. Josephine, despite her age and the risks involved, welcomed them in. She had faced hardship and injustice in her own youth and knew, too, well the pain these girls were experiencing. But helping them was no small feat. Frederick's reach was vast, and he was not a man who took kindly to his victims escaping. Mrs. Josephine, however, couldn't bring herself to turn them away. Her heart ached for the sisters, and she knew that her actions would put her own life in danger. Yet, her compassion for them outweighed the fear she felt. Meanwhile, Frederick was not idle. Upon learning that Mary and Anna had found refuge with Mrs. Josephine, he quickly set in motion a plan to capture them. Frederick's power was rooted in his ability to control local officials, including Michael, the village's police chief, who was entirely under Frederick's influence. Michael had been corrupted over time, accepting bribes and turning a blind eye to Frederick's crimes. With his help, Frederick could intimidate, manipulate, and remove anyone who dared oppose him. But Mrs. Josephine was not so easily intimidated. When Michael and Frederick's henchmen came knocking at her door, demanding she hand over the girls, she refused. Her courage stood firm against the oppressive threat Frederick posed. As the tension in the house mounted, Mrs. Josephine prepared herself for the worst, knowing that her actions could cost her dearly. Still, her resolve did not falter. Inside the small home, Mary and Anna huddled together, terrified for their lives. Anna, who had become gravely ill, was growing weaker by the minute, and the sisters knew they couldn't leave the house without risking their lives. Mrs. Josephine did everything she could to care for Anna, despite the looming danger outside. Her hands trembled as she worked, knowing that at any moment, Frederick's men could break through the door. The cold, dark night outside mirrored the fear that gripped the hearts of the three women inside. The situation grew even more tense as Frederick's men closed in on the house. Mrs. Josephine, aware of the danger, prepared for the worst. She grabbed a gun for self-defense, knowing she was no match for the men physically. But her determination to protect the girls outweighed any fear she had. As the men approached, she stood firm, her hands steady on the weapon, prepared to do whatever it took to keep them safe. When the door finally burst open, the confrontation began. Michael and his men stormed in, demanding that Mrs. Josephine hand over the girls. But she stood her ground, refusing to give in. Michael, unfazed by her defiance, threatened her with violence, but Mrs. Josephine was unshaken. With a quick motion, she fired the gun, sending a clear message that she would not back down. The bullet struck near Michael, startling him and his men. The standoff continued, but it was clear that Mrs. Josephine's resolve had shaken them. Despite the close call, Mrs. Josephine knew that this was just the beginning. Frederick would not be so easily deterred. But for now, she had done what she could. She had protected the girls in their most desperate moment, and they were safe, at least for the time being. However, the danger was far from over. The following days brought a new ally to their cause, Diego, Mrs. Josephine's son, a brilliant lawyer. Upon hearing about his mother's situation, Diego rushed to the village, determined to put an end to Frederick's reign of terror. With his legal expertise, he began to gather evidence against Frederick, knowing that this would be the key to taking him down. Diego worked tirelessly, contacting other victims of Frederick's abuse and uncovering a network of corruption that reached deep into the community. His investigation revealed the full extent of Frederick's criminal activities, from bribery to the abuse of countless women. Diego knew that in order to defeat Frederick, he would need more than just the testimonies of Mary and Anna. He would need solid evidence to expose the powerful man who had terrorized so many. The battle against Frederick was not an easy one. As Diego and his team gathered evidence, Frederick fought back with every tool at his disposal. He used his connections to pressure local authorities, attempted to intimidate witnesses, and even tried to bribe his way out of trouble. But Diego, along with the support of the victims and the villagers, was undeterred. Together, they built a case strong enough to bring Frederick to justice. In the end, after months of legal battles, Frederick was finally arrested. His power was stripped away, and he was held accountable for his crimes. The trial that followed was a turning point not just for Mary and Anna, but for the entire community. With the help of Diego and his team, Frederick was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The villagers, once too afraid to speak out, now found their voices. They celebrated their victory, knowing that justice had prevailed. For Mary, Anna, and Mrs. Josephine, this was a moment of relief and triumph. They had faced unimaginable fear, but through their courage, the truth came to light. This story serves as a powerful reminder that no matter how powerful an individual may seem, justice can be achieved when people stand together and fight for what is right. It also underscores the importance of compassion and resolve in the face of adversity, showing that even in the darkest of times, the light of truth can shine through. A tale of courage and justice. The fight against injustice in a quiet, isolated village. An elderly woman named Mrs. Josephine found herself thrust into a life-or-death situation when two young sisters, Mary and Anna, knocked on her door one cold winter night. These young girls were pregnant, pale from exhaustion, and in desperate need of help. They had been fleeing for their lives from a man named Frederick Lawson, a wealthy, powerful individual who used his influence to exploit and harm vulnerable women. With nowhere else to go and no one to turn to, they sought refuge in Mrs. Josephine's home, hoping for safety. Mrs. Josephine, despite her age and frailty, knew she could not turn them away. She had lived through her own struggles, facing the injustices of a society where power and wealth often trampled over the powerless. She had heard of Frederick Lawson. His name alone filled the villagers with fear. He was a man who had built an empire of manipulation, greed, and cruelty, using his connections with local officials to keep his wrongdoings hidden from the law. When the girls arrived at her doorstep, Mrs. Josephine immediately recognized the desperation in their eyes. They were close to their due dates, hungry and terrified. As she brought them inside, warmed them by the fire, and offered them food, she began to listen to their heartbreaking story. Mary, the older of the two, explained that they had once lived in the city, but their lives had been destroyed by Frederick. Mary had worked at a shop, and Anna had been a student, but both had fallen prey to Frederick's manipulative charm. After being taken advantage of by him, they had no choice but to flee, knowing that if they stayed, Frederick would stop at nothing to ruin them. The more Mary spoke, the more Mrs. Josephine felt a surge of empathy for the sisters. She remembered her own experiences as a young woman, when she too had felt powerless against a corrupt and unjust society. She knew the pain of being trapped, of having no one to turn to. But now the tables had turned. Mary and Anna were here, seeking refuge, and Mrs. Josephine vowed to protect them, no matter the cost. However, Mrs. Josephine also knew the dangers of harboring these girls. Frederick, a man who ruled with an iron fist, would not let them go easily. She had heard whispers in the village of his actions, how he used his power to control the local police, manipulate politicians, and silence those who dared to speak out against him. Mrs. Josephine knew that by taking in Mary and Anna, she was putting herself in great danger. But her compassion outweighed the fear. She would not let the girls be victimized any further. As the days passed, it became clear that Frederick would stop at nothing to reclaim control over Mary and Anna. His influence reached deep into the village, including the local police chief, Michael, who was fully under Frederick's thumb. Michael, once an honest man, had been corrupted by Frederick's wealth and power. He did his bidding, silencing victims and covering up his crimes. When he learned that Mary and Anna had sought refuge at Mrs. Josephine's house, he began to make threats. He demanded that the girls be handed over, using his authority to try to intimidate Mrs. Josephine into submission. But Mrs. Josephine, undeterred, refused to give in. When Michael and his men came knocking on her door, demanding the girls be handed over, she stood firm. She knew that this was not just a matter of protecting the girls. It was a fight against an oppressive system that had allowed Frederick to operate with impunity for so long. Mrs. Josephine's voice was steady as she told them they would not be going anywhere. Despite the danger, Mrs. Josephine would not be intimidated. She knew she had to protect the girls, even if it meant facing down Frederick's powerful henchmen. When Michael and his men attempted to break down her door, Mrs. Josephine took action. In a bold move, she grabbed an old gun from her late husband's collection and aimed it at the door. Her heart raced, but her resolve was unshakable. She would do whatever it took to keep Mary and Anna safe. The standoff between Mrs. Josephine and Frederick's men was tense, but ultimately, it was a turning point. Mrs. Josephine's bravery gave Mary and Anna the courage to stand their ground as well. Though they were terrified, they knew they had someone who would protect them no matter the cost. But this was just the beginning of their fight. The arrival of Mrs. Josephine's son, Diego, a brilliant lawyer, brought a new sense of hope to their cause. Diego quickly recognized the gravity of the situation and began collecting evidence against Frederick. He knew that to take down a man as powerful and corrupt as Frederick, they would need more than just the sisters' testimony. They would need to expose the entire network of corruption Frederick had built. Diego and his team worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and preparing for a legal battle. As the story of Mary and Anna spread, other victims of Frederick's abuse began to come forward, adding strength to their case. The more they uncovered, the more they realized how deep Frederick's influence ran. But Diego, undeterred, pressed on. He reached out to the media, human rights organizations, and anyone who could help in their fight against Frederick's empire of power. Eventually, after months of legal proceedings and mounting public pressure, Frederick was arrested. The walls of his corrupt network began to crumble, and the people who had once feared him now found their voices. Frederick was taken to trial, and thanks to the tireless efforts of Diego and his team, he was convicted of his crimes. His reign of terror was over. The victory was a testament to the courage and determination of Mrs. Josephine, Mary, Anna, and Diego. Despite the overwhelming power that Frederick had once wielded, the light of justice prevailed. Their story serves as a powerful reminder that even in the face of oppression and fear, the truth can shine through when people stand together and fight for what is right. A legacy of courage, the triumph of justice in the depths of a harsh winter night. An old woman, Mrs. Josephine, was forced to confront a situation that would test the limits of her courage and compassion. Two young sisters, Mary and Anna, knocked at her door, seeking shelter from the freezing cold and desperate for safety. With their swollen bellies clearly marking their pregnancy, they were vulnerable, exhausted, and running from a man who had destroyed their lives. Mrs. Josephine, despite her years and frailty, recognized the gravity of the situation immediately. She had lived a lifetime of hardship, and though she had witnessed much pain and injustice, the cruelty of the world never ceased to stir her heart. As she took the sisters in, wrapping them in the warmth of her home, she could not help but be struck by the fear in their eyes. They were too young to be so burdened by such terrifying experiences. The story they told was one of manipulation, betrayal, and abuse. Mary, the older sister, revealed how Frederick Lawson, a wealthy and powerful man, had exploited both her and her sister. At first, he had appeared to be a gentleman, offering Mary gifts, promises, and what seemed like a bright future. However, those promises quickly turned into nightmares. Frederick had manipulated them both, using his power and influence to trap them in a cycle of fear. His threats had forced them out of the city, and now, with nowhere else to turn, they had come to Mrs. Josephine in search of refuge. Frederick Lawson, a man who had built his empire on a foundation of corruption, was infamous for his ability to control those around him. He used money to manipulate local officials, police officers, and even judges. The small village where Mrs. Josephine lived was no exception. Frederick had connections everywhere. He was untouchable. But Mary and Anna were not the first women to fall victim to him, nor would they be the last if he were allowed to continue. As Mrs. Josephine listened to the heartbreaking tale, her resolve began to solidify. She would not turn these girls away, no matter the danger. She had known such fears in her own youth, and she knew that there was no turning back once she had opened her door to them. But the road ahead would not be easy. Frederick's influence ran deep, and he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. In the days that followed, it became clear that Frederick would not let the girls escape his grasp without a fight. The local police chief, Michael, was in Frederick's pocket, and he was determined to bring the girls back to their abuser. He visited Mrs. Josephine's home, demanding that she hand over Mary and Anna. but she refused. As the tension mounted, Mrs. Josephine knew that her life was at risk, but she also knew she had no choice but to protect the girls. When Michael and his men attempted to force their way into Mrs. Josephine's house, she took drastic action. In a moment of desperation, she grabbed a gun, something she never thought she would need to use, and stood firm. She would protect the girls, no matter the cost. Her defiance was a turning point. It was a bold statement that she would not be intimidated by Frederick's power, no matter how dangerous the consequences. But this was just the beginning. As the conflict escalated, Mrs. Josephine's son, Diego, a brilliant lawyer, returned to the village. Upon hearing of the situation, Diego immediately recognized that they needed more than just protection, they needed justice. He was determined to expose Frederick for the criminal he was. Diego quickly mobilized a team of lawyers and began to gather evidence against Frederick, reaching out to other victims who had been too afraid to speak out. As Diego worked tirelessly to prepare their case, more victims came forward. Some had suffered in silence for years, their voices stifled by fear. But with Diego's support, they began to find the courage to stand against Frederick. The more they uncovered, the more they realized the full extent of Frederick's crimes. He had used his power to manipulate the legal system, bribe officials, and silence his victims. But Diego was determined to change that. The legal battle that followed was intense. Diego and his team worked tirelessly to collect evidence, including testimonies from Mary and Anna, as well as other victims. The media also took an interest in the case, and soon the public became aware of Frederick's reign of terror. With the weight of public opinion on their side, Diego and his team began to expose Frederick's corruption. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, it became clear that Frederick's days of evading justice were numbered. Frederick, however, was not without resources. His connections to local officials allowed him to pressure the police and attempt to stall the investigation. But Diego was one step ahead. He knew how Frederick operated and had already anticipated these tactics. The legal team, together with a group of brave victims, kept moving forward, determined to see this fight through to the end. Finally, the day came when Frederick was arrested. His empire of fear and corruption began to crumble, and the villagers who had once lived in fear of him now found themselves standing together. They knew that this victory wasn't just for Mary and Anna, it was a victory for everyone who had suffered at Frederick's hands. The trial was a moment of reckoning. Frederick stood in front of the court, facing charges of sexual assault, bribery, and intimidation. The victims who had once feared him now spoke out boldly, and the evidence against him was undeniable. The courtroom erupted in applause when Frederick was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The people of the village were finally free from his grip. In the weeks that followed, Mary and Anna began to rebuild their lives. With the help of non-governmental organizations, they were able to start fresh. Mrs. Josephine, who had risked everything to protect them, watched proudly as the young women recovered from their ordeal. They were no longer the frightened, vulnerable girls who had knocked on her door. They were survivors, strong, resilient, and ready to build a future. Diego, who had played a pivotal role in their victory, returned to his work as a lawyer, knowing that his efforts had changed the course of many lives. He had not only protected his mother and the sisters, but had also dismantled a corrupt system that had allowed a powerful man to manipulate and destroy others. The story of Mrs. Josephine, Mary, Anna, and Diego is one of courage, resilience, justice. It serves as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the truth will prevail, and that standing together in the face of fear can change the world. Through their determination, they not only found justice for themselves, but also sparked a movement that brought change to an entire community. Their story is a testament to the power of standing up for what is right, no matter the odds. A story of courage, compassion, and justice in the dead of a bitter winter night. The quiet house of Mrs. Josephine was suddenly disturbed by the urgent sound of knocking. The cold air outside had cut through the darkness, and as the old woman sat by her warm fireplace, she could feel the weight of something important approaching her door. It was a time of year where silence reigned, But tonight would be different. The knocking was persistent and full of desperation. Mrs. Josephine, who had lived many years in this remote village, was no stranger to hardship, but this night she knew something was about to change. As she opened the door, she was met with a chilling sight. Two young girls, barely 16, standing in the snow, shivering from the cold and exhaustion. They wore thin, tattered clothing, and their faces were pale from the cold, but it was their swollen bellies that caught her attention. Both girls were heavily pregnant. Mary, the older of the two, whispered in a hoarse voice, "Please, help us." Her words were barely audible, and before she could collapse, Anna, her younger sister, held her up. Mrs. Josephine immediately ushered them inside, slamming the door behind her to shut out the unforgiving cold. Once inside, the warmth of the fire began to settle the girls' trembling bodies, and Mrs. Josephine quickly offered them blankets and a hot cup of tea. She was determined to help them, but questions swirled in her mind. Who were these girls? Why had they come to her? And why were they in such a dire situation? As the girls began to calm down, Mary slowly began to recount their story. It was a tragic tale, one of manipulation, betrayal, and cruelty at the hands of a powerful man named Frederick Lawson. Mary explained how she and Anna had once lived in the city, leading simple lives. Mary worked in a small shop, and Anna was a student. That was until Frederick entered their lives. He appeared to be a sophisticated, charming man, and at first, Mary believed he had her best interests at heart. He lavished her with expensive gifts and sweet promises. But those promises were empty. Frederick, using his wealth and influence, had exploited the girls. Once Mary had discovered the true nature of Frederick's intentions, he had threatened to ruin their lives if they spoke out. Fearing for their safety, they fled, wandering from town to town, avoiding all contact for fear that Frederick would hunt them down. Mary's story sent a wave of anger through Mrs. Josephine. She had lived a long life, and though she had witnessed much in her years, she could feel the weight of the injustice these girls were suffering. She understood their pain deeply. They were victims of a system where money, power, and manipulation could destroy lives. But Mrs. Josephine was not about to let Frederick's cruelty extend any further. She made a promise to the girls that night. No matter what, she would protect them. However, the danger was far from over. Mrs. Josephine knew that by offering shelter to the two young women, she had put herself in grave peril. Frederick was a man who operated above the law. He owned numerous properties, had connections with top law enforcement officials, and used his wealth to maintain his control over the community. He was known for using bribery, intimidation, and violence to get what he wanted, and he would stop at nothing to silence those who threatened his power. The night after the girls arrived, Mrs. Josephine noticed suspicious activity around her property. Frederick's men were closing in, determined to find the girls and bring them back. The police chief, Michael, who was in Frederick's pocket, came to Mrs. Josephine's door, demanding she turn over Mary and Anna. He warned her that Frederick was a dangerous man, and that defying him would have dire consequences. But Mrs. Josephine refused to back down. She had seen enough in her life to know when something was wrong, and she knew she had to act. Determined to protect the girls, she locked all the doors and reinforced the windows. But when the threat escalated, Mrs. Josephine knew that violence was imminent. Armed with a gun, something she had never imagined she would need, she stood ready to fight. When Michael and his men attempted to force their way in, Mrs. Josephine fired a warning shot. The bullet embedded itself into the wall near Michael, causing him to retreat. But the confrontation was far from over. In the following days, as the danger loomed closer, Mrs. Josephine's son, Diego, a renowned lawyer, returned to the village. Hearing of the peril his mother and the girls were in, Diego immediately took action. He knew that protecting his family and the girls was no longer enough. He needed to bring justice to Frederick for all the crimes he had committed. Diego gathered evidence, spoke with other victims who had been silenced by fear, and used his legal expertise to begin a campaign against Frederick. He was determined to expose the corrupt network of officials that had allowed Frederick to operate with impunity. As the investigation unfolded, more victims came forward, encouraged by Diego's bravery and unwavering resolve. With the help of the media and non-governmental organizations, the public became aware of Frederick's abuses. His once impenetrable power began to crack as the victims' voices grew stronger. Eventually, an arrest warrant was issued for Frederick, and the community that had lived in fear for so long began to rally together. When Frederick was arrested, it marked the beginning of a new chapter for the village. The trial that followed was long and arduous, but it was a battle that needed to be fought. With undeniable evidence against Frederick, including testimonies from victims and financial records proving his bribery schemes, the court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first time in years, the villagers could breathe freely, knowing that the man who had terrorized their community would never harm anyone again. Mary and Anna, once trembling in fear, now stood tall. They had fought back against their abuser, and with the support of Mrs. Josephine and Diego, they were able to reclaim their lives. The village, too, had been freed from the shadow of Frederick's control. In the aftermath of the trial, Mary and Anna received the support they needed to heal and rebuild their lives. Mrs. Josephine, who had shown unparalleled courage, watched as the girls moved forward stronger than ever. The story of Mrs. Josephine, Mary, Anna, and Diego is one of resilience, courage, and the power of standing up for what is right. It shows that even in the face of overwhelming odds, justice can prevail, and that compassion and determination can change the course of lives and communities forever. Their victory serves as a reminder that no matter how powerful someone may seem, the light of truth will always pierce through the darkness. The triumph of courage and justice, a tale of hope and resistance on a freezing winter night. An unexpected and urgent knock shattered the stillness of Mrs. Josephine's small, humble house. The quiet of the evening had been broken by the sound of two young girls, barely 16, standing at her door in desperation. It was a strange hour for visitors, and even stranger were the circumstances that led these girls to seek refuge in the warmth of her home. Mrs. Josephine, an elderly woman who had seen much in her years, could not help but be drawn into their plight. As she opened the door, she was struck by the sight of two girls, trembling with cold, their cheeks flushed from the harsh winter wind. They were dressed in threadbare clothing that barely protected them from the bitter chill of the night, but what left Mrs. Josephine frozen in shock was the sight of their swollen bellies. Both girls were heavily pregnant. The older girl, Mary, whispered in a hoarse voice, "Please, help us." Her words barely reached Mrs. Josephine's ears, and before she could speak, the younger girl, Anna, seemed to stumble and nearly collapsed. Without a second thought, Mrs. Josephine pulled them inside, closing the door behind her to shut out the unrelenting cold. Inside, the warmth from the fireplace began to thaw their frozen limbs, but their faces were still filled with fear and exhaustion. As Mrs. Josephine hurried to prepare hot tea and blankets for the girls, she noticed how frail they looked. Their faces were pale, and their bodies bore the marks of abuse and hardship. Anna, with her black hair and dark eyes, said nothing, clearly too weak to speak, while Mary, the older girl, cautiously began to share their story. Her voice trembled with fear, and her hands shook as she held the teacup. It became clear that these girls had suffered greatly at the hands of a powerful man, a man who had torn their lives apart. Frederick Lawson. Mary explained that they had once lived in the city. With simple but content lives, Mary worked at a local shop, and Anna was still in school. Everything changed when they crossed paths with Frederick, a wealthy and influential man who had seemed charming at first. He had convinced Mary that he could offer her a bright future, only to betray her trust in the most devastating way. Frederick's manipulation soon turned into cruelty. He took advantage of Mary and then, after the truth of his actions came to light, threatened to destroy them completely if they dared to speak out. Mary and Anna were left with no choice but to flee, moving from place to place, living in constant fear of Frederick's reach. After weeks of wandering, they had arrived at Mrs. Josephine's doorstep, hoping for a safe haven. Mrs. Josephine's heart ached for the two girls, but more than that, she felt a fire ignite within her. She could not and would not let them fall into the hands of this man. As she listened to their story, memories of her own youth resurfaced: the fear, the oppression, and the unjust treatment by those with power. She knew the despair these girls were feeling all too well. But more importantly, she knew that she had the power to protect them. "Don't worry," Mrs. Josephine reassured them. "You're safe now. You've come to the right place. I won't let anyone hurt you." Despite the comfort in her words, Mrs. Josephine knew the danger she had placed herself in. Frederick was no ordinary man. He was a ruthless figure in the village, with vast resources, connections to top law enforcement, and a network of influence that reached far beyond the small community. He was known for his manipulation of the legal system, his ties to corrupt officials, and his violent tactics to silence anyone who stood in his way. That very night, Mrs. Josephine noticed shadows lurking outside her home. Frederick's men were watching, waiting for the moment to strike. The police chief, Michael, one of Frederick's most loyal allies, came to her door with a cold and menacing demand: hand over Mary and Anna, or face the consequences. The threat was real, and Michael, who had been compromised by Frederick's bribes, was not one to be trusted. But Mrs. Josephine refused to back down. She made it clear that she would not open the door to these men. Inside, she prepared herself for the worst, knowing that the girl's safety and her own was at risk. She locked all the doors and reinforced the windows. But when she heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching, her resolve only strengthened. If necessary, she would protect the girls with her life. The confrontation escalated quickly. Michael and his men attempted to force their way in. Mrs. Josephine, her hands trembling but her will unwavering, grabbed the gun her late husband had left behind. When they tried to break in, she fired a warning shot. The bullet hit the wall next to Michael, causing him to retreat momentarily. But Mrs. Josephine knew that this was just the beginning of a long and dangerous battle. The next day, Mrs. Josephine's son, Diego, a skilled lawyer, arrived in the village. Upon hearing of the threat against his mother and the girls, Diego immediately sprang into action. He knew the law would be their only hope in taking down Frederick. With his legal expertise and connections, Diego began collecting evidence and rallying other victims of Frederick's abuse. As he dug deeper, he uncovered the extent of Frederick's corruption, bribing officials, silencing witnesses, and causing the disappearances of women who dared to speak out. The fight was not just about protecting Mary and Anna anymore. It was about exposing the corruption that had allowed Frederick to thrive for so long. Diego, with the help of his colleagues and a growing number of brave victims, began to fight back. The legal battle would be long, but they were determined to make sure Frederick's reign of terror came to an end. As the investigation gathered momentum, the support of the community grew. The villagers, who had long been afraid to speak out, began to find their voices. With the help of the media and human rights organizations, the case gained national attention. The pressure on local authorities to act became undeniable. Eventually, the police had no choice but to issue an arrest warrant for Frederick. When Frederick was arrested, it marked the beginning of a new era for the village. The trial that followed was intense, with many victims testifying against him. The evidence against Frederick was overwhelming: testimonies, financial records, and the unwavering courage of those who had once been silenced. In the end, Frederick was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and his network of corruption began to unravel. Mary and Anna, once broken and fearful, now stood strong. With Mrs. Josephine's guidance and Diego's relentless pursuit of justice, they had triumphed over the darkness that had once consumed their lives. Their story was one of survival, of finding strength in the face of fear, and of the power of one person's refusal to remain silent in the face of injustice. In the end, it was not just Mary and Anna who were freed, it was an entire village. The courage of one woman, Mrs. Josephine, and the unwavering determination of her son, Diego, brought about a change that none of them could have imagined. Together, they had dismantled the corrupt system that had long held them in fear, and in doing so, they brought justice to all who had suffered under Frederick's tyranny. a story of strength, justice, and compassion, the fight against Frederick Lawson. Late one cold winter night, a knock echoed through the quiet house of Mrs. Josephine. At an age when most would be fast asleep, Mrs. Josephine, seated by the fireplace, had been enjoying a peaceful moment with a book in hand. But the unexpected knock shattered that stillness, signaling the arrival of two young girls who were on the brink of desperation. They were barely 16, dressed in thin clothes unsuitable for the harsh, freezing night, and both of them were visibly pregnant, their bellies swollen as they shivered from the cold. With a mixture of concern and curiosity, Mrs. Josephine opened the door, revealing these fragile figures standing before her, exhausted and fearful. The older girl, Mary, with trembling hands, managed to whisper, "Please help us." Her voice was strained from hunger and the bitter cold, while the younger sister, Anna, looked too weak to speak, only nodding silently. Their appearance was enough to stir any compassionate heart, and Mrs. Josephine, without hesitation, ushered them into her home, closing the door to protect them from the elements outside. Inside, the warmth from a fire and a cup of tea offered the girls some comfort. Mrs. Josephine, although an elderly woman, could immediately see the physical toll the journey had taken on them. Their faces were pale from exhaustion, their hands frostbitten, and there were faint bruises around their wrists that suggested they had been through much more than just the cold. After making sure the girls were as comfortable as possible, Mrs. Josephine asked them who they were and why they were out in such harsh conditions. Mary, with a trembling voice, explained their story. They had once lived in a city where Mary worked at a shop and Anna was still in school. Their lives took a dark turn when they crossed paths with Frederick Lawson, a wealthy and powerful man who deceived and exploited them. Frederick manipulated and abused them, and when they tried to expose him, he threatened their lives, forcing them to leave everything behind and flee. They had wandered for weeks, constantly looking over their shoulders in fear of Frederick's wrath. Hearing this, Mrs. Josephine's heart went out to the girls. The stories they told echoed the painful memories of her own youth when she too had faced the brutal reality of an unjust world ruled by powerful men. Despite the danger they faced, Mrs. Josephine made a vow to protect them. She could see the fear and uncertainty in their eyes, but she reassured them, "You don't have to be afraid anymore. You're safe here. I won't let anyone hurt you." Little did she know, offering shelter to these young women would set in motion a series of events that would bring her face to face with a man whose cruelty and power had dominated their lives. Frederick Lawson was no ordinary man. He was known throughout the region for his wealth, his influence, and his ruthlessness. Not only did he control several properties and businesses, but he also had connections with high-ranking law enforcement officials. He was above the law, manipulating those around him with money and intimidation. Frederick's ability to charm and manipulate people, especially young women from difficult circumstances, was unparalleled. He won their trust with sweet words, gifts, and promises of a better life, only to later reveal his true, malicious nature. His victims often found themselves trapped in a web of fear and despair, unable to escape his control. Mary and Anna were only the latest in a long line of victims, but they were different. They refused to give in to his demands and, despite his threats, chose to keep their children. When Frederick learned that the girls were pregnant, he became enraged. He demanded that they have abortions to erase any evidence of their betrayal. When they refused, his fury grew. He would stop at nothing to silence them, even if it meant eliminating them entirely. Frederick's power extended far beyond personal crimes. He had bribed officials, manipulated the justice system, and used his wealth to protect himself from any consequence. Local police, including the chief, were in his pocket, and anyone who opposed him was quickly removed. Frederick's wrath reached the doors of Mrs. Josephine's house. She knew the danger of harboring these girls, but her resolve was stronger than the fear that gripped her. As the threats against her grew, she remained determined. When Frederick's men came to her door demanding that she hand over Mary and Anna, she refused. Her house became a battleground, with the sound of violent knocks echoing through the night. The police chief, Michael, who had been bought by Frederick, arrived with his men to force their way in, but Mrs. Josephine stood firm. She pulled out a gun that had been passed down from her late husband and fired a warning shot, making it clear that she would protect the girls at all costs. Despite the danger, Mrs. Josephine remained calm and resolute. She told Mary and Anna to stay inside and promised to protect them no matter the cost. The standoff continued, but when Frederick's men began to break into the house, Mrs. Josephine stood her ground. She knew the battle ahead would be long and perilous, but she was ready to fight for the girls who had nowhere else to turn. In the days that followed, Mrs. Josephine's son, Diego, a skilled lawyer, arrived in the village. When he learned of the threats against his mother and the girls, he immediately began to gather evidence and build a case against Frederick. With the help of other victims, Diego worked tirelessly to expose Frederick's criminal activities and to ensure that justice would prevail. The investigation revealed a vast network of corruption, with Frederick at the center, manipulating the legal system and silencing anyone who dared to speak out. Through determination, patience, and the strength of their community, Diego and his team were able to gather enough evidence to bring Frederick to trial. The entire village, once living in fear, began to stand up for what was right. Frederick, once untouchable, found himself facing the consequences of his actions. He was arrested, and his power crumbled. Mary and Anna's courage, combined with Mrs. Josephine's unwavering support and Diego's legal expertise, dismantled the network of fear and corruption that had ruled their lives. Frederick's downfall was not just a victory for them, but for the entire village. It was a reminder that, no matter how powerful someone may seem, justice can prevail when people stand together in the face of evil. This story is a testament to the power of compassion, resilience, and courage. It teaches us that even in the darkest moments, hope and justice can rise above fear and oppression. Mrs. Josephine, with her unshakable faith in doing what was right, played a key role in ensuring that Mary, Anna, and others like them would have the chance to build a better future, free from the tyranny that had once controlled their lives. The power of courage and compassion, a story of justice and survival. Late one winter night, two young sisters, Mary and Anna, found themselves standing at the doorstep of an elderly woman named Mrs. Josephine. The cold air bit at their skin, and their exhaustion was evident. Dressed in thin clothing, both were pregnant and close to giving birth, their bellies swollen with the weight of their circumstances. They had nowhere else to turn. The cold night seemed endless, but they knocked on the door, desperate for help. Mrs. Josephine, an elderly woman living alone in a remote village, was startled by the knocking. As she opened the door, she saw the two girls standing in the snow, shivering from the bitter cold. Despite her frailty, Mrs. Josephine's heart was moved by their plight. Without hesitation, she brought them inside, offering them warmth and food. Her kindness was immediate, as she provided them with hot tea and bread, asking them to rest and regain their strength. But she knew something was wrong. Why were these young girls out in such weather? Why were they so far from home? The girls, trembling and weak, began to share their story. They had once lived in the city, where Mary worked in a shop and Anna was a student. Their lives took a dark turn when they crossed paths with Frederick Lawson, a wealthy and powerful man who manipulated and exploited them. Frederick had taken advantage of their vulnerability, and when they tried to speak out, he threatened to destroy their lives. Fearing for their safety, they fled the city, wandering from place to place, with nowhere to go and no one to trust. Mrs. Josephine listened carefully, her heart aching for the girls. She understood all too well the fear they felt, having experienced her own struggles in the past. She reassured them, telling them that they were safe now. But she also knew that by taking them in, she was placing herself in grave danger. Frederick was not a man to be taken lightly. His power was vast, and he had connections with law enforcement and the highest levels of society. Frederick was known throughout the region for his ruthless nature. He controlled everything around him, from businesses to politics, using his wealth and influence to manipulate others. He had gotten away with numerous crimes, from assaulting young women to bribing officials and silencing anyone who dared to speak out. The girls, realizing they could not go on hiding forever, had turned to Mrs. Josephine for help, a decision that would set off a chain of events that would change the course of their lives forever. Knowing the dangers they faced, Mrs. Josephine promised to protect them at all costs. She knew that Frederick would stop at nothing to silence the girls, especially since they were pregnant. His fury grew when he found out, and he threatened to force them to have abortions to erase all evidence of his actions. But the girls refused. They would not give up their children, no matter the cost. They had been pushed to their limits, but they held on to the hope that one day they would find justice. As the days passed, Mrs. Josephine's home became the battleground. Frederick's men began to surround her house, waiting for the moment when they could force their way in. Despite the mounting pressure, Mrs. Josephine stood firm. She knew that she could not give in to fear. She would protect Mary and Anna, even if it meant risking her own life. As the tension escalated, Mrs. Josephine's son, Diego, a renowned lawyer, arrived in the village, determined to help his mother and the girls. Diego quickly began to gather evidence and support from others who had been victimized by Frederick. Together with a team of lawyers, Diego worked tirelessly to expose Frederick's crimes and to bring him to justice. They uncovered a vast network of corruption and manipulation, with Frederick at the center, using money and power to silence his victims. As the investigation progressed, more victims came forward, sharing their stories and giving the legal team the ammunition they needed to take Frederick down. With the help of the village and a dedicated legal team, the case against Frederick finally went to court. The trial was long and grueling, but the evidence was undeniable. Frederick's empire of fear began to crumble as witnesses testified about his crimes, and his corrupt connections were exposed. Ultimately, the jury found Frederick guilty of sexual assault, bribery, and organized crime. He was sentenced to life in prison, with no chance of parole. Mary and Anna, who had once lived in fear, could finally breathe a sigh of relief. They were free from Frederick's grip, and justice had been served. Thanks to the courage and compassion of Mrs. Josephine, the determination of Diego, and the strength of the victims, Frederick's reign of terror had come to an end. The village, once silenced by fear, now stood united, ready to rebuild and support one another. This story serves as a powerful reminder that, even in the darkest of times, there is hope. It teaches us the importance of standing up for what is right, protecting the vulnerable, and never letting fear dictate our actions. Through courage, compassion, and unity, justice can prevail and change is possible, no matter how powerful the enemy may seem. A story of revenge, forgiveness, and redemption in a small village. A boy named Xavier grew up in the shadow of his parents' rejection. Born with a physical deformity, he was abandoned by those who should have loved him the most. As a child, Xavier was told that he was worthless and that he would never amount to anything. The rejection cut deep, but little did anyone know that his story was far from over. Years passed, and Xavier found himself at a crossroads. He had been neglected and mistreated, but the pain turned into something far more potent: anger. Fueled by the resentment of his early years, he vowed to get revenge on those who had cast him aside. His burning desire for justice was now replaced with a thirst for retribution. The people who had once turned their backs on Xavier lived their lives without consequence. They didn't know the pain they had caused, nor did they care. However, Xavier never forgot the hurt they inflicted on him. As he grew older, he began to formulate a plan to make them pay. The day would come when he would confront them and show them the consequences of their cruelty. Xavier's plan began to take shape when he returned to the village, now a successful and confident young man. He had transformed into someone who no longer resembled the helpless child he once was. His success, wealth, and newfound strength made him an entirely different person, and he was ready to execute his plan for revenge. But when the moment came, and he was about to take his revenge on those who had wronged him, something unexpected happened. In the midst of his bitterness and anger, Xavier saw something he hadn't anticipated: vulnerability. The people he had once sought to punish were no longer the same. They had grown older, some had experienced their own hardships, and they now carried the weight of their past actions. Instead of the satisfaction he thought he would feel by seeking revenge, Xavier experienced something much deeper. He saw that the pain of his past had shaped him into the person he was, but so had the compassion and forgiveness that came with letting go of bitterness. Xavier realized that revenge would never heal the wounds of his past. The desire for payback only kept him tethered to the anger and sadness he had carried for so long. He understood that his healing could only come from breaking free from the chains of hatred. By forgiving those who had wronged him, he could finally find peace. The forgiveness that Xavier extended wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about freeing himself from the burden of carrying resentment. He chose not to let his past define his future, and instead, he began to build a life based on understanding, compassion, and redemption. He forgave those who had once rejected him, not because they deserved it, but because he deserved freedom from the chains of anger that had held him captive for so long. The people who had rejected Xavier were taken aback by his change of heart. They were not used to seeing someone they had hurt show such kindness and understanding. It was a stark contrast to the angry young man they had once known, and it forced them to confront their own actions and the consequences of their past cruelty. Xavier's journey teaches us a powerful lesson about the transformative power of forgiveness. Revenge may seem like a way to right the wrongs of the past, but it only perpetuates the cycle of pain. True healing comes from letting go of resentment and choosing forgiveness. Xavier's decision to move past his anger didn't just change his life, it changed the lives of those around him as well. In the end, Xavier found peace not through revenge, but through the redemptive power of forgiveness. It was a decision that allowed him to reclaim his life and, in doing so, showed others that healing is possible even after the deepest wounds. His story reminds us that forgiveness isn't just about others, it's about freeing ourselves from the weight of the past, and in doing so, creating space for a brighter future. In a small village, Xavier's story began with pain and rejection. Born with a physical deformity, he was abandoned by his parents, who refused to accept him as their son. From a young age, Xavier was taught that he was worthless and undeserving of love. The sting of rejection ran deep, and it stayed with him throughout his childhood. However, as time went on, Xavier grew stronger. He was determined to prove those who had abandoned him wrong. He transformed into a young man driven by anger and resentment, seeking revenge on the very people who had once cast him aside. His pain had turned into a thirst for retribution, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make them feel the same hurt he had experienced. As Xavier matured, he worked tirelessly to build a new life for himself. Through hard work and determination, he became successful, wealthy, and self-confident. He returned to the village with a new identity, one that was no longer defined by his deformity or the cruelty he had faced. Armed with the power to confront those who had wronged him, Xavier began to devise his plan for revenge. But as he prepared to exact his retribution, something unexpected happened. He met the very people he had longed to punish, and instead of feeling triumphant, he was struck by something he hadn't anticipated: vulnerability. The people who had once rejected him were not the same. They had grown older and had faced their own hardships. They were no longer the powerful figures they once were, and Xavier realized that seeking revenge would not bring him the satisfaction he had imagined. In that moment, something profound shifted inside Xavier. His desire for revenge began to wane, replaced by the realization that holding on to anger would only keep him trapped in the past. He understood that the cycle of pain could only be broken through forgiveness. By letting go of the bitterness that had defined so much of his life, Xavier could finally free himself from the weight of his past. Xavier made the difficult decision to forgive those who had once rejected him. It wasn't about excusing their actions or pretending the pain didn't exist. It was about releasing the hold that anger had over him. Through forgiveness, he found peace. He chose to no longer let the actions of others determine his future, and in doing so, He liberated himself from the chains of resentment that had bound him for so long. This act of forgiveness transformed not only Xavier, but also the lives of those around him. The people who had once harmed him were forced to confront their own actions, and they began to see the consequences of their cruelty. The forgiveness Xavier extended wasn't just an act of mercy toward others, it was a gift he gave to himself. By forgiving, he healed, and in turn, helped heal the community. Xavier's journey serves as a reminder that while pain and rejection can shape our lives, we do not have to let them define us. Revenge may offer temporary satisfaction, but does not bring lasting peace. True healing comes from the power of forgiveness both for others and for ourselves. Xavier's decision to let go of anger allowed him to reclaim his life and build a future free from the burdens of the past. In the end, Xavier's story teaches us that healing is possible when we choose to move forward with compassion, not vengeance. His decision to forgive allowed him to find redemption, not just for himself, but for those who had once wronged him. By choosing forgiveness over revenge, Xavier found peace and freedom, and in doing so, became a source of inspiration for others in the village to do the same. In a small village, an elderly woman, Mrs. Marta, lived a simple life, surrounded by her memories and a deep connection to the land she had known all her life. One fateful evening, two young sisters, Mary and Anna, appeared at her doorstep in the dead of night, seeking refuge from a violent and unforgiving world. The winter air had already begun to bite at their skin, and their exhaustion was evident in every shiver they made. As they stepped inside, a sense of warmth and safety enveloped them, far from the brutal circumstances they had fled. Mary and Anna, both pregnant and desperate, shared their heartbreaking story with Mrs. Marta. They had been living in the city, but a powerful man, Frederick Lawson, had destroyed their lives. Frederick, a man with wealth, connections, and no morality, had taken advantage of both sisters. When they had tried to speak out against him, he had threatened their lives. Fearing for their safety, they had been forced to leave everything behind, wandering from place to place, too afraid to trust anyone. When they stumbled upon Mrs. Marta's humble home, they dared to hope for the first time in weeks that they might find a safe haven. Mrs. Marta, hearing their story, felt a surge of compassion and deep sorrow. She remembered the dark days of her own youth, when she had faced oppression and fear. But it was also these memories that made her more determined to protect these girls. She had seen too much pain in her life to turn a blind eye to the suffering of others. As an older woman, she knew what it meant to endure hardship, and she could not let these two innocent souls fall victim to a man as corrupt as Frederick Lawson. Despite her age, Mrs. Marta immediately set to work. She made the sisters food and provided them with comfort, but her mind raced with thoughts of the danger they were in. Frederick, a ruthless and powerful man, would stop at nothing to maintain control and silence anyone who threatened his empire. Mrs. Marta knew that by offering shelter to Mary and Anna, she had already made herself a target. But her heart would not allow her to turn them away. She vowed to protect them, no matter the cost. The next morning, the tension in the air was palpable. As Mary and Anna rested, Mrs. Marta looked out her window, feeling the presence of danger closing in. Frederick was not a man who would tolerate being defied. His wealth and influence had allowed him to control every aspect of the village, including the law. The police, once honest officers, had become mere puppets in his hands, and anyone who dared to oppose him faced grave consequences. Mrs. Marta knew that this situation could escalate quickly, and the girls' lives were at risk. As the day wore on, Mrs. Marta prepared herself for whatever was coming. She had lived through enough to know that sometimes you had to fight back to protect the ones you loved. When a knock on the door came, her heart skipped a beat. She knew it would be Frederick's men, but she stood tall and resolute, ready to face whatever came next. She did not open the door immediately, but kept her composure, gathering her courage. When Frederick's men finally arrived, they demanded that she turn over Mary and Anna, threatening to take them by force if necessary. Mrs. Marta, unwavering in her stance, refused to give in. Her voice was calm, but firm as she told them they would have to go through her to take the girls. She had no intention of letting the fear she had carried for so long control her. She was ready to stand up to Frederick's tyranny, even if it meant facing him directly. The men tried to intimidate her, but Mrs. Marta's resolve only grew stronger. She wasn't just protecting the girls anymore. She was protecting herself from a lifetime of regret for not doing what was right. She knew the risks, but she also knew that sometimes standing up to evil was the only way to stop it. As the confrontation escalated, Mrs. Marta made it clear that she would not back down. Her bravery in the face of such danger would serve as a reminder to the entire village that standing up for what was right was the only way to truly defeat the forces of darkness. Mary and Anna, though terrified, watched in awe as Mrs. Marta displayed the kind of courage they had never known before. The battle was not just for their survival, it was for the soul of the village itself. This small, unassuming woman had become a symbol of hope, a beacon in the darkness. In that moment, they realized that the courage they had been searching for was right in front of them. And no matter what happened next, they would fight alongside Mrs. Marta to protect the future they deserved. Mrs. Marta's refusal to give in to fear inspired not only Mary and Anna, but the entire community. Her actions set in motion a wave of resistance against Frederick, signaling the beginning of the end for his reign of terror. In that small, isolated house, a spark of hope had been lit that would soon spread throughout the village. Mrs. Marta had shown that no matter how old you are or how difficult the odds may seem, standing up for what is right can change everything. In life, we often face moments where we must choose between standing up for what is right or succumbing to fear and complacency. The story of Mrs. Marta, Mary, and Anna teaches us that no matter how difficult the circumstances, courage and compassion can lead to meaningful change. Even in the face of overwhelming danger, Mrs. Marta's unwavering commitment to protect these young women demonstrates that standing up for others is not only a moral duty, but also a powerful act of defiance against injustice. This lesson is particularly relevant as we grow older and face our own challenges. It reminds us that age should never limit our ability to make a difference. The choices we make, whether big or small, shape the world around us. By showing kindness, standing up for what is right, and never losing hope, we can inspire others and create a ripple effect of positive change. Life may not always be easy, but the courage to act with integrity can offer us peace and fulfillment, knowing that we've done our part to leave the world better than we found it. Thank you for watching this heartfelt video. Your support means a lot to us. If you found inspiration in this story, make sure to hit like and subscribe to Stories TH for more uplifting and moving content. We're grateful to have you as part of our AB.